A woman like you walking through Manhattan. Mocking voices rang out as Sarah Mitchell walked in her faded hoodie, clutching an old tote. To the crowd, she was nothing but ordinary, unworthy of notice. But then came the roar of engines. An armored column screeched to a halt before her. To the stunned silence of all dozens of soldiers burst from their hatches, saluting in unison, as the commander's voice thundered, "Salute General Mitchell." Sarah stood there 31 years old, her loose black hair catching the summer breeze. Her gray hoodie hung loose, the cuffs frayed from years of wear. Her jeans were faded, her sneakers scuffed at the toes. She didn't look like much, not to the people bustling past her on Fifth Avenue. The sun beat down glaring off the glass towers, and the air smelled of hot asphalt and coffee carts. Sarah's face was bare, no makeup, no polish, just a quiet kind of beauty that didn't demand attention. But it was there if you looked close, her sharp green eyes, the way her jaw set when she walked. She carried herself with a kind of purpose, like she knew exactly where she was going, even if no one else did. The tote bag slung over her shoulder was canvas-worn thin, with a faded logo from some hardware store. It bumped against her hip as she moved through the crowd, her steps steady measured. She had learned to walk like that a long time ago, under a different kind of sun, in a place where every step mattered. Years back, she'd stood in the dust of a desert base, her boots sinking into the sand. The air had been thick with diesel and the hum of machinery. She'd been younger then, her hair pulled back tight, her uniform crisp despite the heat. Soldiers had moved around her, their eyes sharp with respect, their voices low when they spoke her name. She'd been their commander, their general leading an elite armored unit through missions no one talked about outside classified briefings. The kind of work that left scars, some you could see, some you couldn't. She'd left that life behind, walked away after one order she couldn't unhear. Now here she was, years later on a New York sidewalk, and nobody knew, nobody cared. To them, she was just another face in the crowd, someone who didn't belong among the polished suits and designer bags. A street vendor nearby, his cart piled high with pretzels, watched Sarah pass. His hands paused mustard bottle in midair as he squinted at her. There was something in her walk, a rhythm he'd seen before back when he'd served back, when he'd stood at attention for someone who carried that same weight. He set the bottle down, wiped his hands on his apron, and muttered to himself, "That's no ordinary woman." A tourist grabbing a pretzel overheard and laughed, nudging his friend. "What's with this city? Everyone's got a story." But the vendor didn't laugh. He just kept watching Sarah, his fingers twitching like he wanted to salute but didn't dare. A kid nearby, licking an ice cream cone, pointed at Sarah's tote and giggled. "Mom, look at that bag. It's so old." His mother shushed him, but her lips twitched in a smirk. The weight of judgment hit Sarah, sometimes like a punch she didn't see coming. She'd catch her reflection in a shop window, plain, unremarkable, and her hand would tighten on the strap of her tote. Not out of shame, but because she remembered who she was, who she still was. The world might not see it, but she carried it in her bones. Sometimes, when the city's noise got too loud, she'd close her eyes for a second and hear the rumble of tanks, the crackle of a radio, her own voice giving orders. Once, years ago, she'd stood in a command tent, a map spread out before her, her finger tracing a route through enemy territory. Her soldiers had watched her waiting for her call. She'd made it, and they'd followed. That was the weight she carried now, even in sneakers and a hoodie. A delivery guy on a bike swerved close to Sarah, his eyes flicking over her as he muttered, "Out of the way, lady. This ain't your runway." His buddies nearby laughed, their voices carrying over the hum of traffic. Sarah stepped aside, her movements calm, deliberate like she was dodging something heavier than a bike. Her fingers brushed the edge of her tote and she kept walking, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The delivery guy sped off, but one of his friends called after her, "Go back to wherever you came from." The words hung in the air, sharp and careless, as the crowd moved around her, oblivious. "Hey, before we go further, can you do me a quick favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to share these stories with you, and I'd love to know you're out there listening." All right, let's keep going. It was high noon, the kind of summer day where the heat made everyone a little meaner. Sarah was heading down Fifth Avenue, the shops glittering with displays of things she'd never buy. The crowd was thick tourists, snapping photos, locals rushing to lunch meetings, kids weaving through with ice cream dripping down their hands. She kept her head down, not out of shame, but because she didn't feel like meeting anyone's eyes. That's when she heard it. The first jab. "Who wears a ragged hoodie in this blazing heat?" The voice was sharp, dripping with mockery. It came from a guy in his mid-20s, his tie loose, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder. He was standing with two other office workers, all three of them sipping overpriced coffee, their eyes scanning the crowd for something to laugh at. They had found Sarah, a woman in a sleek blazer, her nails painted fire engine red, leaned toward her friends and smirked. Bet she's lost. Probably wandered in from some dive bar downtown. Her voice was loud enough for Sarah to hear, deliberate, like she wanted to make sure it landed. Sarah's fingers brushed the edge of her tote, her knuckles whitening for just a moment. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the jab. But her lips pressed into a thin line, and she adjusted her grip on the bag, her movements precise, controlled. The woman's friends snickered, one of them snapping a quick photo with her phone. "This is going viral," she said, her voice gleeful. #CityTrash. A passerby, a guy in a polo shirt, overheard and chuckled, shaking his head like Sarah was a joke everyone was in on. Sarah didn't stop walking. Her pace didn't falter. But her jaw tightened just for a second as she reached the corner and stopped at a red light. The crowd pressed in around her, the air thick with heat and judgment. She stood there, her tote resting against her leg, her hands still. And then from the edge of the crowd, an old man's voice broke through. He was sitting on a folding chair, a small table in front of him, covered with veterans' pins and patches. His face was weathered, his cap faded, but his eyes were sharp. He stared at Sarah, his hands gripping the edge of his table. "That gait," he said almost to himself, unmistakable. "That's a march." The office workers heard him and laughed, their voices sharp and cruel. "Crazy old man," the guy with the tie said, shaking his head. "What's he even talking about?" His friend, the woman with the purse, rolled her eyes. Probably thinks she's his long-lost army buddy or something. They kept laughing, their phones out now, snapping pictures of Sarah standing there waiting for the light to change. But Sarah turned her head just slightly, and her eyes met the old veteran's. For a moment, the noise of the city faded. She gave him a small nod, barely noticeable. The veteran straightened in his chair, his hand snapping to his brow in a salute. It was crisp, deliberate, the kind of gesture that carried weight. Sarah didn't return it. She just held his gaze for a second longer, then looked back at the street. A woman pushing a stroller nearby caught the exchange and scoffed. What's she supposed to be, some kind of hero? Her voice was loud, meant to be heard. She adjusted her sunglasses, her lips curling in disdain. People like her don't belong here. Her friend, carrying a designer shopping bag, nodded. "She's just embarrassing herself," she said, her tone cold. Sarah's hand paused on her tote, her fingers tracing the worn stitching. She didn't look at the women, but her shoulders squared just a fraction, her posture sharpening. The light changed, and she stepped off the curb, her steps as steady as ever. The crowd moved with her, but the mockery didn't stop. A man in a tailored coat, his watch gleaming under the sun, leaned toward his colleague and said, "Look at her, acting like she owns the place. Doesn't she know where she is?" His colleague, a woman with a designer scarf, laughed softly. "Some people have no sense of shame," she said, her voice low but venomous. Sarah's sneakers scuffed the pavement, but she didn't slow down. Her eyes flicked to a nearby shop window, where a reflection caught a glimpse of her old unit's insignia on a passing truck's license plate. Her breath caught just for a second before she kept walking. A memory flickered, standing in a briefing room, her hands steady, as she pinned a map to the wall, her soldiers waiting for her next move. She blinked and the memory was gone. A street performer, his guitar case open for tips, paused mid-strum as he watched Sarah. He'd seen a lot on these streets, but something about her made him stop. He leaned forward, his fingers resting on the strings, and whispered to a passerby, "That's not just anyone. Look at her eyes." The passerby, a guy in a hurry, scoffed. "What, you think she's famous or something? Give me a break." But the performer shook his head, his gaze fixed on Sarah. He started playing again, a slow, steady tune like a march he hadn't heard in years. A couple of teenagers nearby laughed, one of them mimicking Sarah's walk, exaggerating the rhythm. "Look at her strutting, like she's in the army," one said, his voice mocking. Sarah's hand tightened on her tote, but she didn't break stride. The light changed again, and Sarah stopped at the next crosswalk. The guy with the phone was filming now, his voice loud and mocking. "Look at that face, pretending it's a parade," he said, zooming in on Sarah's profile. The woman next to him, young and dressed like she had just stepped off a fashion blog, shook her head. "Bad cosplay," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "What's she supposed to be, some kind of soldier?" The laughter spread, rippling through the people nearby. A couple of tourists joined in their giggles, nervous, but eager, like they didn't want to be left out. Sarah stood at the corner, her back straight, her tote still swinging lightly at her side. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than their words. A woman in a bright sundress, her designer sunglasses perched on her head, nudged her friend and laughed. "Oh, please, she's milking it now. Thinks she's some kind of war hero." Her friend, clutching a smoothie, nodded. Pathetic. Who does she think she's fooling? Sarah's hand didn't waver, her eyes locked on the distance. A man nearby, his briefcase swinging, muttered to his coworker, "She's just looking for attention. Probably wants to go viral." His coworker smirked, adjusting her earpiece. "Well, she's got the wrong audience." Sarah's fingers brushed the edge of her hoodie, her movements slow, deliberate, like she was steadying herself for something. Then from somewhere down the avenue, a low rumble started. It was faint at first, like thunder rolling in from a distance. People turned, craning their necks to see. "What's that sound?" Someone asked a guy in a delivery uniform, his hand shading his eyes. The rumble grew louder, deeper, the kind of sound you felt in your chest. Sarah's head lifted just a fraction, her eyes narrowing. The crowd was buzzing now, voices overlapping. "Is it construction?" a woman asked, clutching her shopping bags. "No, that's engines," someone else said, a kid with a skateboard under his arm. And then they saw it, an armored column rolling down Fifth Avenue U.S., flags snapping in the wind. Tanks, Humvees, troop carriers, their metal gleaming under the noon sun. The crowd erupted, a parade. In New York, a man shouted, his voice half excited, half confused. Sarah pivoted her body, shifting to face the convoy. Her stance changed, feet squared, shoulders back, like she was standing on a drill field instead of a city sidewalk. The office workers didn't notice at first, too busy pulling out their phones to film the vehicles. But the guy with the tie, the one who'd started it all, pointed at Sarah and laughed. "She thinks they're looking at her," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. The woman in the white dress, the one who'd called her homeless, scoffed. "Those salutes are for generals, not nobodies." A kid nearby, maybe 10 years old, tugged at his mom's sleeve and piped up, "Miss, they don't know you." The crowd laughed again, their phones raised, capturing every moment, every jab. Sarah didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the convoy, and then slowly she raised her hand to her forehead in a formal salute. A young woman with a camera, her press badge swinging, pushed through the crowd and aimed her lens at Sarah. "Hey, you," she called out, her voice sharp. "What's your deal? You think you're part of this show?" The crowd around her chuckled, some clapping like it was a performance. Sarah's salute didn't falter, but her eyes flicked to the woman for a moment, steady and unyielding. The photographer hesitated, her finger pausing on the shutter. Something in Sarah's gaze made her step back, her confidence wavering. A man nearby, his suit rumpled from a long day, muttered, "She's just some wannabe. This is embarrassing." Sarah's hand stayed at her brow, her posture unwavering. The sound of the engine stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. The armored column braked hard, the vehicles lurching to a halt in the middle of the avenue. Hatches popped open, and soldiers stood up, their movements sharp and synchronized. Dozens of them, their hands snapping to their brows, saluting towards Sarah. The crowd went quiet, the laughter dying in their throats. A commanding officer leaned out of the lead vehicle, his voice booming over the street. "Salute General Mitchell." The words hit like a shockwave. The guy with the phone froze, his camera still pointed at Sarah. The woman in the white dress took a step back, her sunglasses slipping down her nose. The kid's mom pulled him close, her mouth open, but silent. A man in a polo shirt, his Rolex catching the sun, tried to break the tension. "This has to be staged," he said, his voice loud but shaky. "Some kind of publicity stunt." The woman with the purse nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, they probably hired her to stand there and look sad." But the soldiers' faces told a different story. No trace of a show, just stone-cold respect. An older woman in the crowd, her hands trembling as she clutched her cane, spoke up. "I've seen that kind of salute before. My husband got one at his funeral. That's no act." Her voice cracked, and the crowd around her shifted uneasy. A young soldier nearby, his helmet tucked under his arm, looked at Sarah and nodded, his eyes shining with something like pride. Sarah stood there, her salute steady, her face unreadable. The soldiers held their positions, their eyes fixed on her. The city seemed to hold its breath, the horns and chatter falling away. The guy with the tie tried to laugh it off, his voice shaky. "It's a commercial shoot," he said, glancing at his friends for support. "Yeah, hired extras," the woman with the purse added, but her words sounded hollow. The soldiers' faces didn't waver, no smiles, no hesitation. Just discipline. The old woman with the cane spoke again, her voice stronger now. I saw that salute at a valor ceremony years ago. It's real. The air grew heavier, the tension thick enough to choke on. A young soldier barely out of his teens climbed out of a Humvee and stood at attention, his eyes locked on Sarah. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn at the edges. He held it up, his voice steady but loud. This is her citation. Medal of Valor, 7th Armored Brigade. The crowd murmured, some stepping closer to see. The paper was creased like it had been carried for years, but the words were clear. Sarah's name was there in bold print. Her hand lowered, her salute complete, and she gave the soldier a single nod. A woman nearby, her arms crossed, whispered to her friend, "That can't be real." "Can it?" Her friend didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the paper. Sarah tugged at the collar of her hoodie, just enough to show a faint scar on her collarbone, a steel falcon etched into her skin. A soldier in the convoy shouted, "That's the 7th Armored Brigade emblem." The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. The legendary unit, someone whispered, a man in a business suit who'd been quiet until now. The laughter was gone, replaced by murmurs, by wide eyes and dropped jaws. Sarah nodded once, a small gesture like she was acknowledging the soldier, but not the crowd. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. A kid in the crowd, his baseball cap crooked, stared at Sarah and whispered to his dad, "Is she really a general?" His dad didn't answer, just put a hand on his son's shoulder, his face pale. The teenage girl with the earbuds, the one who'd mocked Sarah's drama, stood frozen, her phone slipping from her hand. Her friend grabbed her arm, whispering, "Is that really her?" The girl didn't answer, her eyes wide as she watched Sarah. A man nearby, his camera still rolling, lowered it slowly, his face pale. I didn't know he muttered more to himself than anyone else. Sarah's tote brushed against her leg as she shifted her weight, her movements calm, deliberate. The crowd was starting to part now, giving her space like they were afraid to stand too close. A woman in a floral dress, her hands clutching a coffee cup, whispered, "I feel sick." "We were so wrong." Her friend nodded, her eyes wet. The whispers started again, but they were different now. "It makes no sense," a woman said, her voice low, almost guilty. "A general wandering New York like a beggar." The guy with the tie shook his head, his confidence crumbling. "If she's really a general, why wear rags?" The woman in the white dress crossed her arms, her lips tight. "She must have fallen from grace," she said, but her voice lacked the venom it had before. Doubt was spreading like ripples in a pond. People were looking at Sarah differently now, their eyes lingering on her worn sneakers, her faded tote, but Sarah didn't wait for them to figure it out. She turned and started walking, her steps as steady as ever, the tote swinging lightly at her side. A news van pulled up at the edge of the crowd, a reporter scrambling out with a microphone. She pushed through, her cameraman trailing behind, and called out, "Ma'am, can you tell us who you are?" Sarah didn't stop, didn't turn. Her hand brushed the strap of her tote, and she kept walking, the sun catching the faint scar on her collarbone. The reporter hesitated, then turned to the crowd, her voice urgent. "Does anyone know her?" The old veteran still at his table chuckled softly. "You don't forget a general like that," he said, loud enough for the camera to catch. A man nearby, his briefcase open, dropped a pen as he stared at Sarah's retreating figure. "I've heard that name before," he muttered, his voice shaky. Mitchell," from the news. Years ago." The command vehicle rolled forward, stopping just in front of her. A 3-star general stepped out, his uniform, crisp, his face weathered but firm. He stood rigid, his hand snapping to his brow in a salute. "The entire unit awaits your orders, Commander," he said, his voice carrying across the silent avenue. The crowd didn't move, didn't breathe. Sarah returned the salute, her movement precise, practiced. Then she lowered her hand and kept walking, the noon sun glinting off her hair. The soldiers held their salutes, their eyes following her, until she disappeared around a corner, swallowed by the city. A young woman in the crowd, her hand shaking, dropped her phone. "I filmed her," she whispered, her voice breaking. I laughed at her. A woman in the crowd, her hands clutching a shopping bag, dropped it to the ground. Her face was flushed, her eyes wet. "I called her a nobody," she whispered, her voice breaking. The man next to her, the one in the polo shirt, looked away, his jaw tight. The reporter from the news van was still filming, her voice shaky as she spoke into the microphone. "We don't know her story, but this moment, this is something we'll never forget." The crowd was silent now, the weight of their words settling over them like dust. A kid nearby, his skateboard forgotten, stared at the convoy and whispered, "She's a hero, isn't she?" His mom nodded, her hand tight on his shoulder. The guy with the tie was the first to break. He shoved his phone in his pocket, his face pale. A week later, his boss called him into an office. "You're done," the boss said, sliding a termination letter across the desk. The video he had posted, the one mocking Sarah, had gone viral, tagged with comments about his company's toxic culture. He had cost them a major contract. The woman in the white dress, the one who'd sneered so easily, found her face plastered across social media. Someone had dug up her name, her job, her history of snide remarks at charity events. Her firm quietly let her go, citing reputational concerns. The woman with the sleek bob, the one who'd called Sarah's tote a thrift store reject, lost her sponsorship deal with a fashion brand. The company didn't say why, but the timing wasn't hard to figure out. The teenage girl who'd laughed at Sarah's drama sat at home that night scrolling through her phone. The video of the convoy was everywhere, shared and reshared, with comments calling out the crowd's cruelty. Her name wasn't in the posts, but she felt the sting anyway. She deleted her own video, her hands shaking, and didn't post again for weeks. The street performer, the one who'd seen something in Sarah's eyes, wrote a song about her. He played it the next day, his voice carrying over the avenue, and people stopped to listen, their faces solemn. A woman who'd been in the crowd, the one with the floral dress, came back to the performer's spot and dropped a 20 in his case. For her, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The old veteran, the one who'd seen her march, sat at his table the next day, his pins and patches laid out as always. But people stopped, now asking questions, wanting to know what he'd seen. He didn't say much, just shook his head and smiled. "Knew it the second I saw her," he'd say, tapping his chest. "Some things you don't forget." The kid who'd spoken up, the one who'd said the soldiers didn't know her, came back with his mom a few days later. He left a small American flag on the veteran's table, his eyes wide with something like awe. A man nearby, his suit wrinkled from a long day, stopped to buy a pin. "For my dad," he said, his voice low. He served with the 7th. Sarah didn't see any of it. She didn't check social media, didn't read the headlines that started popping up about the mystery general on 5th Avenue. She kept walking her tote over her shoulder, her sneakers scuffing the pavement. She'd learned a long time ago to keep moving, to let the world catch up on its own. The city kept humming around her, oblivious, but the air felt different now. Lighter somehow, like the truth had settled into the cracks of the sidewalk, quiet but undeniable. She passed a newsstand, her face on a tabloid cover, but she didn't stop. She just adjusted her tote and kept going, her steps steady as ever. In the heart of New York, in broad daylight, a woman who looked like nothing special turned out to be a legend. The crowd had laughed, judged, dismissed her. But when the engines roared and the salute snapped, they saw her for who she was. Not a victim. Not a nobody, just Sarah, and that was enough. You've been judged before, haven't you? Felt the sting of eyes that didn't see you, words that cut too deep. You stood tall anyway. You kept going. You weren't wrong for it. You were never alone. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.